Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today to discuss a very hot and relevant topic of the lessons that could be gleaned from the experience of the intelligence agencies during the Cold War to the current circumstances and challenges facing the U.S. and its allies is Fred Hoffman, who is the Mercyhurst University Intelligence Studies Assistant Professor and who has a 30-year record of work in the intelligence community as a human intelligence officer in the DIA as well as in other agencies, and who has had the opportunity to live in Berlin during the Cold War to directly experience some of these issues firsthand, including in particular Russian disinformation. Not at all anything that should be ignored in this day and age. Fred, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Irina. Thank you.
And I understand that your work in this field also includes a book specifically on this topic, as well as a college course which discusses the role of the intelligence in the Cold War. And so I'd like to bridge this gap between history and contemporary developments. And I don't believe that we can look in depth at today's events without also looking at history. And I think the problem is a lot of the Cold War expertise has been lost in the decades before the breakup of the Soviet Union and the more recent challenges faced from Russia and its network of allies. And this is something that we need to kind of look around, see what happened, and how we can relearn some of these lessons and apply them to today's. So one of the things that I do want to ask you, it seems to me that the playbook for the Cold War is there. There were certain things that just worked. And the US, of course, was also on the front lines of both intelligence and relatedly information wars during the peak of the Cold War. During the 80s, we had agencies that dealt with that sort of thing. It wasn't perfect, but it was there. Today, the US is really struggling with not only putting out its own messaging, but even understanding the methods of the other side. What can explain this huge disconnect, despite the fact that we have a wealth of historic record to go by?
Well, there's a lot of things I could talk about. One, I'd like to start off talking about Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at during the Cold War, I was a human intelligence officer in Berlin. And at the time I was doing that, Vladimir Putin was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB. He worked in Dresden at the Residentura in the city of Dresden. And I'd like to talk for a moment about what he experienced, because I think in the case of all human beings, you need to understand what people have experienced and how that colors their perception of the world and their later behavior. And I think it's definitely applicable with Vladimir Putin. So what happened, he was in Dresden, he enjoyed life in Dresden, gained a few pounds, drinking German beer and eating good food. And, you know, by his own admission, he enjoyed his time there. So he had come from a very lowly background. His family was not exactly in the upper strata of Soviet society. So for him to become an officer in the KGB and have an overseas posting was very, very prestigious. But here's what happened. In the 1980s, East Germans, defying East German law, by the way, would watch West German TV and realize that their own government was lying to them and that the West was not evil, the West was not enslaved. They're watching TV shows and they're seeing how people in the West have nice houses, nice cars, kids going to school, going to tennis lessons, this kind of thing. And East Germans started asking themselves, well, wait a minute, why are we being lied to? We don't like this anymore. So the point here is that Vladimir Putin knows from firsthand experience the impact that media has on a population. So that's one thing to keep in mind, his attitude toward the media. So then what happened was when in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, it didn't just fall on its own one morning. It was a culmination of popular protests and people speaking out against the government and having their Monday night demonstrations. And I experienced this living in West Berlin. So here's the thing for why it's relevant for Vladimir Putin, because he went from having this nice lifestyle and having this nice experience with his wife he was married to at the time. And then what happened was the whole thing collapsed around him. And it collapsed around him, according to Putin, because of Western intelligence agencies. He blames the West in particular, the CIA. He blames everything on Western intelligence agencies, right? That this was the reason for what happened in East Germany and later in the former Soviet Union. So my point is, Putin, as KGB officer, went from being on top of the world to being basically unemployed in St. Petersburg until he was offered a job in the local administration, and that kind of salvaged his career. So, and he actually experienced this twice, by the way. He experienced it first in Germany in 1989 when he, by his accounting, came out with a pistol and told East German protesters to get away from the residency, KGB residency. It would be defended by force if necessary. He also later on experienced the collapse of the former Soviet Union. So twice in his lifetime, he had negative experiences with the people rising up, with in part spurred on by the media and access to the media. So these are two lessons for him. Number one is the power of the media, and number two, in his mind, that, oh, this is all Western intelligence agencies doing this. So now if you fast forward to the future, you've got a former KGB officer who was traumatized. I mean, I don't know how else you would characterize that as being traumatized, because he had to give up his position. He later lost his job when the Soviet Union collapsed and there was no money anymore for the KGB. So this was something he remembered. Here's another thing people need to recall about Vladimir Putin. When Vladimir Putin was in the KGB, the rule for the KGB was that they had to spend, every KGB officer had to spend 25% of their time on creating disinformation stories. So why is that relevant for today? It's relevant for today because first, the former Soviet Union and now the Russian Federation are the world leaders in disinformation. Okay, so Putin, as a former KGB officer, he was subject to the same rules as everybody else. So he had to spend 25% of his time on disinformation. And if you look at the organizational structure, the funding, the operations of the KGB, you see that, yes, they did a lot of foreign intelligence collection, they did a lot of things domestically, but they spent an awful lot of time on active measures to include disinformation. So that's his lineage, that's his history, and quite frankly, there's something called heuristics, right? We as human beings do what we know. So if I had certain experiences in life, they shape my reaction to certain things. If I, as a man, walk down a street late at night and I've never been mugged or I've never been attacked, I'll perceive that differently than, let's say, my wife, who maybe she's been attacked, maybe she's weaker, and maybe from a female perspective or her personal experiences are different, she may react differently. That's heuristics, right? So here's Putin reacting in part from the trauma that he experienced in Dresden, but also from his loss of a prestigious position later on when the former Soviet Union collapsed. And on top of that, he's got this knowledge of the power of disinformation. So I think all of those things are relevant when you look at Cold War intelligence, and in particular, how it influenced the thinking of Vladimir Putin.
Now, it's interesting that Putin is so poorly understood by the West, despite the fact that what you said makes complete sense. I also find it interesting that he blames the collapse of his institutions, Russian intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union, on US intelligence agencies and not on the governments, meaning Reagan and Thatcher, who were giving the orders to these intelligence agencies to carry out the job. Now, are we talking about a projection here because so much of the Soviet politics were driven by the security apparatus?
Yes, well, that was part of the problem. So the analogy I always tell my students, because I teach a class on intelligence in the Cold War, I teach classes on disinformation and things like that, is I create the picture, the mental image that they can relate to, and I say, you ever go to the gym and you see a guy who's in the gym and all he ever does is bench press. The only exercise he does is bench press. So what happens is he has an enormous chest, maybe big arms, but he has legs like a chicken, and the students laugh. But the problem was, this was the former Soviet Union. they spent an inordinate amount in I'm trying to think of what the exact percentages are, but far more than the Western countries did. Even in the United States, we spend certainly far less than 10% on our defense. The former Soviet Union spent an inordinate amount of money on defense and on security. And the problem was they were like the weightlifter with the chicken legs, right? They didn't diversify their economy. They basically ran out of money. Okay. And Mikhail Gorbachev, who a lot of folks in the West admire, understandably, there are things that he had done, but what that I admire as well. But the thing is, what people don't realize is he was basically forced into that situation by what his predecessors had done. They spent the country into oblivion. They did. And the East Bloc, the Warsaw Pact countries, the former Soviet Union were all similar in that respect. They spent themselves into, in the case of the former Soviet Union, into oblivion. They couldn't sustain what they had started. But the problem is nobody wanted to acknowledge that. Nobody wanted to admit that, say, and this is human nature too. Nobody wanted to say, oh, we did this to ourselves. We were so stupid, but that's the reality. It wasn't, I would love to say that Western intelligence services were responsible for that. We weren't, okay? Not by a long shot. But the point is, it's not human nature to look at ourselves and say, we did this to ourselves. We always want to find an external scapegoat, somebody else to blame. But there's another component to this. When Putin talks about, let's take a look at some of these recurring themes in his disinformation campaigns, right? The expansion of NATO. If I had a nickel for every time I've heard somebody in Russia today in the Putin government saying, oh, NATO promised not to expand. Really? Show me the treaty. Show me the treaty. And this is what I'm always getting on social media. Well, we promised. No, we didn't promise them that. We didn't promise them that NATO wasn't going to expand. So that's one fabrication. The other is that NATO is somehow a threat. Now, the thing is, I've been around a while. I first joined the intelligence community. It was 1985, okay, when I first became active in it. So the point is, I've been around a while, and I know what NATO's capabilities were in the 1980s, and I know what they were after 9/11. After 9/11, NATO had to regroup and deal with counterterrorism. We pulled our tanks. The U.S. military pulled the last tank out of West Germany in 2012, right? Loaded it up in Bremerhaven, sailed it home. So NATO is not the NATO of the 1980s, when we had this military standoff between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, okay? So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that's been cultivated by this generation of propaganda that's been pumped out by the Soviet media and also through other channels.
Well, based on what you're saying, the post-Soviet intelligence services in Russia are very much following the same line as before, with some amendments, with more alliances with organized crime, but by and large, the strategy is very much the same, and in many respects, it's working. We should have been prepared for this onslaught of fake news and disinformation and outright fabrications and lies, because this is what these people have been trained to do. This is their knowledge base, and this is how they used to dealing with the world. Now, knowing that they have limited options as to what they have offered, they seek to discredit everybody else. Why weren't we better prepared?
Well, I used to have a professor. When we would ask him a question, he would say, do you want the 4-minute, the 4-hour, or the 4-day answer? This is a great question. I'll try to give you the Reader's Digest version. Part of the problem with disinformation is autocratic governments are very good at disseminating disinformation, all right? Liberal democracies are not very good at responding to disinformation. The reason is we have freedom of information. That's problem number one. You don't have freedom of information in Russia today. Mm-hmm. You don't. And this has been the culmination of 24 years of Putin's rule, starting with the Kursk disaster in 2000, shortly after he came to power. He had gotten elected, I think, in March, and I think the Kursk incident happened, I want to say, in August. But the problem is he still had the holdover free Russian media under Boris Yeltsin, and they were very critical of Putin and his government. And here again, think back on what he experienced in Dresden. He wasn't going to allow that to happen at home, so that's when he really went after the Russian media. So if you were an opponent of the Russian government and you were a journalist, that's why Russia is one of the most dangerous places in the world for a journalist, because you're going to get harassed. You may get killed, like Anna Politkovskaya, and other people have gotten killed. You may be driven into exile, but you're going to get neutralized. Okay, so what's happened over the past 25 years in Russia is the development of this propaganda platform of what had been an independent media. Okay, so that's domestically. Now look at overseas. We have very different situation. I can get on social media. I could say the most critical thing I want to about the president of the United States, and I don't have to worry about getting arrested at my office or go home and find police cars in front of my house. That's not how we operate. Anybody can say anything, and that's our First Amendment rights. Those are our freedoms, and we value those. The problem is those very freedoms work against us when you have a determined adversary pumping out through various channels disinformation, because some people read that and they believe it, and there's no synchronized counter from the government, and that's another problem, right? It's very difficult for the current administration, and it doesn't matter what political party is in office. It really doesn't matter, because what happens is people say, "Oh, that's a partisan perspective," and you're engaging in propaganda. So it's number one, it's our freedoms work against us, because now we have these streams of lies coming from various sources and channels over time. And that the other thing is Vladimir Putin and his propagandists, they don't just come with a massive lie and expect us to believe it. What they do is they're very selective in their targeting. They know who they want to influence, let's say election influence. They know what groups they want to influence. They know what those groups already believe. They tell lies that are consistent with those existing beliefs. And then what happens is you have people that become useful idiots, and they repeat these fabrications, right? Or they see something online and they say, "Oh yeah, this is consistent with what I believe. I'm going to share it with my 20 friends." Now multiply that by several thousand people, and you can see what the root of the problem is. So just to wrap up what I kind of laid out, I touched a number of different things, but the bottom line is it's really advantageous to be an autocracy and have and I don't care if it's Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, the mullahs in Iran, whoever it is. If you have an autocracy, you just tell everybody jump and they say how high, right? So you tell them what they should disseminate, and they go out and they push out those lies. So it's advantageous to do disinformation if you are an autocracy. And again, if you're a liberal democracy, you are vulnerable to all of these side effects of our freedoms. So what do? Do you get rid of your freedoms? I wouldn't want to do that, but we have to find a better way of dealing with disinformation.
No, it's very obvious that we can't, no person can spend their entire time parsing through every piece of exaggerated stories or suspicious planted things. But there are red flags about things that are very obviously not in line with reality. And while there is government corruption in the US, and there has always been, and frankly, no country is immune from internal problems, at one point we were able to distinguish between our own set of things that we needed to fix, and the fact that there are in fact external enemies trying to harm us using exacerbating distrust against our government. What is it that has changed that made the job so much easier, that some people are more willing to suspend disbelief into the of Russian propaganda and actually embrace it, or actually believe that it is better than whatever problems we're facing here? I mean, during the height of Cold War, we certainly had our share of internal issues, but that never caused most people to suddenly gravitate towards the Soviet Union.
Right. That's a great question. And I think the biggest culprit in this is social media. This is the big, if you think about it, prior to 2006, how did we use the internet? You used the internet, you went to the internet, you obtained information, maybe you bought something online, but that was basically it. After 2006, you had this proliferation of social media platforms where you're not just taking information from the internet, you're putting out your thoughts, your beliefs, and you're sharing them with people, right? And that's one problem. Another problem is that because of what I mentioned earlier, where the Russian government, the proliferators of these lies, what they do is they very carefully study what these interest groups already believe, and they tailor their lies to conform and be consistent with what those folks already believe. So this is why you see a lot of Republicans, for example, MAGA Republicans, that are latching on to a lot of these propaganda lies. And what happens is, if we have influencers on social media, so in other words, if I follow somebody and I respect their opinion and they start pumping out this information, if I'm not an expert in that field, I may just sort of accept blindly what they're saying because I've accepted what they've said on other things. You know, so I think this is I think social media is the biggest problem. And because it is relatively new, again, 2006 is not that long ago, and the government really hasn't quite figured out the best way to cope with that.
Well, with all due respect to influencers, at the end of the day, having people who have, say things that we like to hear is no substitute for common sense. Since when do we expect, we have people who are professionals in one industry, mouthing off on all other issues, and we accept those things even though they don't have the background. And normally the very same people claiming that these alleged iconoclasts are truth tellers are the ones who are complaining about the fact that a lot that the government preaches to them on issues they're not competent in. We have Elon Musk, who may be a very accomplished businessman, but he's not an expert in geopolitics. Fine, he can have his opinions. It's a free country, but why should people take an opinion of a businessman who is not familiar with how intelligence works for the for truth? Or let's say a medical authority who starts having political opinions and talks about Russia as if they've lived there all their lives. So this is kind of this dilemma that on the one hand people distrust experts because they believe experts take shortcuts, they lie, they're not always the experts they claim they are, but then they take people who have zero background whatsoever and believe them. So this disparity in social perception and lack of ability to think critically and independently, I mean, these same people call themselves independent thinkers, but they're still following somebody. They're following an authority of their making. They're not just saying, well, listen to this, I don't need somebody from Fox News or from CNN telling me what to think. I can examine the facts, I can look at 10 different versions of the story, and then I'll try to figure out what makes more sense. No, but still, the same people who claim to be nonconformist, independent, free of government influence, still place their faith into something. So how do we battle with this, sort of immature political thinking?
Well, I think a big part of the problem is if you think about what propaganda is, right? And propaganda around and propaganda, if you think about it, it used to be a neutral term. It didn't have this kind of pedantic meaning that it does today. In the 1920s and 1930s, when radio first came out, for example, we used propaganda here in the United States, get people to support the government. But then we also had fascists and totalitarian regimes like in the Soviet Union that used it for more nefarious purposes. But think about what propaganda is. Propaganda is not meant to influence how I think. It's meant to influence how I feel, right? And how and that sets me down a different path. If it sets me down the path to thinking, then I'll consider what's being said and I'll weigh that against other things that I've heard and other things that I know, and I'll talk to people I respect. But if I'm attacked, so to speak, with propaganda on a visceral level, okay, I just react with how I feel. And that is a really big problem with disinformation, because a lot of it just appeals to how people feel rather than how they think, because how we think and how we feel are two different things. If I could very quickly, in the 1980s, the former KGB in the former Soviet Union, they actually put out a very effective disinformation campaign. And what they did was the AIDS campaign was going on in the United States. So AIDS had just surfaced in the early 80s. People had no clue what it was, how to deal with it. And a lot of people believed that maybe the government had, these conspiracy theorists thinking, well, maybe the government created AIDS. So here's what they did in the Kremlin is they said, hey, you've got these people, a segment of the American electorate, they already think that maybe the government created AIDS. So let's push out a story. And they were very deliberate. They were very methodical in how they perpetrated this disinformation campaign. And what they did is they ran a little story in a little magazine in India that, by the way, the KGB owned, English language publication in India, 1983. And they alleged that the AIDS virus had actually been created by the U.S. Army, and it had been created to target gays and minorities, Black people, right? So AIDS was created by the military, and it was intentionally created by the U.S. Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland, to target gays and Black people. So here's the problem: if you already have people in the U.S. that were inclined to think that anyway, this story, right, that storyline would resonate with them, emotionally resonate with them. They'd say, see, this is what we've been saying, right? So what happened was the KGB did some other things during the course of the 1980s. They had a couple of professors on their payroll in East Germany. These two professors that were in the biology field, and they put out some papers saying, oh yeah, this is what happened. And those papers actually got a lot of traction in Africa. A lot of African countries, people in African countries said, oh, see, here's some, medical evidence supporting what was alleged in the Indian paper years ago, right? So what ended up happening was this story ended up getting traction. It got traction to the point where Mike Wallace, I want to say CBS or NBC News, I forget which, did a story on it in 1987. So the point is, this disinformation story actually got into the U.S. mainstream news between 1983 and 1987. That's all it took. Okay. So, and here again, it was a story attempting to target people's emotions. People who already felt this, and that what they heard resonated with them because they already had suspicions about the U.S. government. So this is what makes disinformation so insidious, is that it targets our emotions. Social media is the best thing to ever happen to folks that push out disinformation. It's like God's gift, because now they can reach so many more people and influence those people by multiple different conduits.
Well, there's 2 points worth noting here. First of all, mainstream media has also become far less credible in many ways. There's a lot of partisanship. There's a lot less fact checking. There's a lot of clickbait going, and quite frankly, there's a lot of stories that are simply planted by various parties, corporations, and whatever. Or if they're not outright planted, they certainly end up being picked up by people who don't have time to verify its origin, or who, for whatever ideological reasons, to think that it will promote their editorial line. So we have that mainstream journalists kind of becoming less and less aimed at the general population and more polarized. We have the social media impact. We have government distrust, and the government has not always been perfect, but it's still better than, I would say, Russian and Chinese government, even with all these shortcomings. We have corruption. We have all these issues that are adding up. We're creating a perfect storm of circumstances, and at the same time, we are still constrained at being able to push back in the same manner and solve the same type of confusion abroad. And frankly, we also have less access. So is it even doomed to become, to be vanquished by a storm of fake news from far, economically weaker countries with, significant governance issues?
Well, here's the secret, the dirty little hidden secret of disinformation. The point of disinformation is not to make you believe the lies. The point of disinformation is to make you believe nobody. That's really what it comes down to. So in other words, the degree, and part of it is we're our own enemies, because part of the reason why there's less belief in the media is I grew up with a different media in the United States than what the media we have now. Part of it is because of deregulation. Part of it is, the rules have changed and media can do things that they didn't do in the past. They're trying to improve the size of the target audiences. So what ends up happening is 30 years ago, when I turn on the news and I listen to Walter Cronkite or somebody like that telling me here's what happened, and then at the very end of the broadcast, there would be maybe a 30-second or 1 minute segment, and it'll say editorial opinion. And the news, they would give you what their opinion was about some issue. right? You had a differentiation between news and opinion. Now, you get basically opinion supported by some selected facts that support the storyline or the narrative that a media outlet is pushing. And I don't care what media outlet you pick. It doesn't matter if it's on the right or on the left. They all do it. They all do it. And so what happens is we've already, separate from the whole disinformation issue, separate from that, we've already got a problem where media credibility is crumbling because of things the media is doing differently. But on top of that, and amplifying and magnifying that, are these disinformation storylines.
Now, I want to go back again to the past and take a look at what it was actually like to be dealing in a somewhat simpler environment, but nevertheless an environment where the adversarial intelligence was trying to do all these things, and where, you know, as an intelligence officer, you had to figure out what was the truth, what was isn't, what source was trustworthy, what source was there to deceive and to distract. How did it work? How did you manage, and how did you manage to verify anything, given that everyone had an agenda and had, and you know, very likely was lying to some extent?
Right. Well, this is part of the problem if you're doing human intelligence operations, for example. You can never assume that the person is being truthful. And even if they're being truthful today, that doesn't mean they were truthful yesterday. It doesn't mean they will be truthful tomorrow. So you always want to corroborate. You always want to get verification. So if somebody gives me a story and says, you know, oh, they moved these 50 tanks out of the base and they're no longer there. Well, okay, that's a human intelligence report. Do I have any signal intelligence to verify that? Do I have any imagery intelligence? Are there other human beings that are providing information about this that support what's being said, right?
Mhm.
So there, you know, and this is still true today, but it was a lot easier back in the good old bad old days of the Cold War, and that's what I call it, the good old bad old days, because things were a lot more black and white. It was a lot easier when you could point to what was going on in East Germany and in the Warsaw Pact and say, look, these people don't have freedoms. Look, you know, you see it in the news, that's what they have. This is what we have. Which do you prefer? So it was a lot easier to convince somebody that what we were doing was quote unquote right. Were we perfect? No. Right? Were we free from corruption? No. I mean, every country exists on a corruption scale. No country is free of corruption. All right. It just doesn't happen. But what's interesting, just let me digress for a minute. One of the propaganda themes coming out of Putin's folks is, oh, Ukraine is full of Nazis and they're terribly corrupt, right?
Mhm.
Well, here's the thing. Every one of the 15 former Soviet republics was corrupt because they came from a corrupt Soviet culture, all right? You know, my wife is Russian. I've been to Russia. You know, I'm not ignorant about the lifestyle. East Germany was like that too. You basically had to do what you needed to do to get by to survive, right? So in that culture, you had this culture of what we would call corruption. And the problem is, it's not something you can get rid of from one day to the next. And I think Ukraine has done a pretty impressive job of ridding themselves of corruption. Look at the Baltic states, right? Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. They were also corrupt, right? And they've had to get rid of that as well. So again, it's not a light switch where you can just turn the switch and say, oh, no more corruption, it's gone, right? But this is one of the propaganda themes. And because people who already have this preconceived notion of what the former Soviet Union was, they hear this, oh, well, the Ukrainians are all Nazis, they're all corrupt. Oh, well, that's just the way it used to be. Not true. Not true. But you have to have some knowledge to counteract those lies, to recognize that, wait a minute, Ukraine's doing this better, right? Their law enforcement is better. They're doing this and that. Police on the street are better, right? So, but this is knowledge. This is factual information that has to be used to deflate these inaccurate allegations about Ukraine.
Now, one of the issues is, of course, we had reorganized our own security apparatus significantly. On the one hand, we have a lot of people. On the other hand, we have had issues with shifting to counterterrorism and then trying to shift back. And there's been people who were hired to do jobs that are, you know, not necessarily human intelligence oriented, and there's been a loss of very hardcore expertise. There's a different culture in some aspects. People are complaining about government politicizing intelligence, various, both, all administrations doing that to some extent, and political agendas driving the issues inside of intelligence. So in an environment where you have adversaries trying to discredit everything US intelligence is doing, how can intelligence agencies accurately present information to the public and to government officials without it turning into this mess that we are watching? And there are real issues, but then there are issues that are being deliberately played up by various political agendas.
Right. Well, part of the problem is, there's an expression in the intelligence community about intelligence failures and policy successes, right? So if something works out, it's because we had wise leaders that made proper policy, right? But if something doesn't work out, it's an intel failure, And the truth is, it's not quite that easy, because here's the thing. In the intelligence community, if you're an intelligence analyst, you're taught about structured analytic techniques. You're taught about how to make the way you do intelligence analysis transparent. So if somebody says to you, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, we use this technique and we analyze this information, and this is why we believe what we believe. So you're taught to do that in the intelligence community. Here's the problem. Politicians aren't taught that. Politicians don't do that. And if you look at, for example, when we went into Iraq in 2003, you had President Bush, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, all saying they were absolutely convinced that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, but the intelligence didn't support that. And now we look back and we see there was a massive disconnect between what they were told by the intelligence community and what they believed. Okay, because here again, they're not professional intelligence analysts. They're not trained to take intelligence information and to make appropriate decisions based on that. Okay, so there's a big problem for the intelligence community is delivering intelligence to somebody who may already have preconceived notions, who may already believe things that aren't supported by intelligence, right? So this is a challenge for us. So I don't think that the problem was intelligence collection or analysis or the messaging that the intelligence community gave in the case of the Iraq War and in other situations. I think the problem is the disconnect between the intelligence that's given and the caveats that are given, right? So in other words, if we say, look, this is human reporting, this is only one source. For example, Curveball. Curveball was an Iraqi engineer. If I could digress for a moment. So Iraqi engineer defected, went to Germany in the late 1980s. And what it was is he was a smart guy, because he said, I'm an engineer, and if I give the Germans some information of value, they're going to pay me, they're going to treat me nice, they're going to give me a place to live. And that's what he did. He fabricated stories about mobile biological warfare labs. Here's the problem. We didn't have any other human reporting to corroborate that. We couldn't find any imagery or signal intelligence to verify what the guy said. So when the information was collected and provided up the chain, it had all kinds of caveats. So the people who listened to him would put their field comments and say, hey, we don't know whether he's saying is true. It's credible. He's an engineer. This could be true, but we have no verification. Here's the problem. The further up the food chain that goes, the more truncated the information is provided, and the caveats get stripped away. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely.
So this in reality is emblematic of the problem that the intelligence community consistently faces. There are very, very bright people in the intelligence community, but they can only do so much.
Now, it's interesting enough that you say that, because Russia today is very much driven by one politician's opinion and not necessarily by political intelligence gathering, as we have seen from the circumstances leading up to the second Ukraine invasion. Obviously Russia was able to recover since then, but it certainly had significant costs. And had US politics worked out differently, maybe the war would have been over by now. But regardless of all of that, we are facing our own challenges. But on the other hand, we are also seeing that there are challenges on the other side. So how do we take advantage of the understanding that, that the Kremlin approach is not necessarily reliant on the best intelligence? How can we use this to our advantage to kind of disseminate doubt on the other side and to undermine Russia with its own weapons.
Right. Well, I think a couple of aspects to your question I'd like to address. The first is Vladimir Putin was he went into Ukraine thinking it was going to be a 3-day thing. In fact, he wouldn't even he called it a special military operation. You're not allowed to, you can go to jail for 15 years if you call it a war, right? His troops that were coming out of Belarus, they were told, oh, you don't have to bring rations and extra water. Bring dress uniforms, because in 3 days we're going to have a parade in Kiev, right? So why did Putin believe this? Putin believed this because he had been lied to by the SVR, by GRU, by his intelligence services, who had their own agendas and had their own reasons for conveying these lies to him. But the bottom line is he really thought it was going to be a 3-day thing, and it wasn't. So it really called into question the reliability of his own security services, right? Number one. Second thing is look at the way wars are fought by countries like Russia compared to the way the United States fights a war. You pick any conflict and there's one general officer or admiral that you can point to and say, that's the guy who was in charge, right? 1991 Gulf War, okay? Norman Schwarzkopf, he was the guy. 2003 invasion of Iraq. You have every conflict we've had somebody in the military we could point to. Here's the problem. Putin's worried about getting replaced in a coup. He doesn't trust his generals. So he doesn't allow any of them to rise up beyond a certain level because, and this goes back to like Stalin and Zhukov, if you think about it, right? This is kind of a tradition. You don't want to trust your generals because someday your general might be sitting in your chair, So this is a problem. This is something I think we could cultivate, all right? This trust, because the thing about autocracies is they are impregnable and they are permanent until they're not. Look at what happened to Ceausescu, right? One day he's in power, he's the authoritarian, he's the strong man, and the next day he's lying on the side of the road, executed. Okay, so Putin doesn't want to end up like Ceausescu. He doesn't want to end up like Gaddafi. He doesn't want to end up like Saddam Hussein. This is his nightmare. So he's afraid of a coup. He doesn't necessarily trust his own people under him because they've already lied to him in the past, and there's the possibility that someday they could replace him. So I think this is something that we need to cultivate more, because look at the messaging we're getting from Russia now. They're all powerful and they can create more artillery shells and they can just have an endless supply of tanks. But this is nonsense. This is not. Putin right now is like a heavyweight fighter in a 15-round fight, and it's round 12, and he's losing and he's running out of energy. That's reality. That's not what the messaging is, though, because it works to Russia's advantage if the rest of the world thinks Russia can continue this indefinitely. They can't. Russia can produce, whatever it needs to fight this war. They're already sending in conscripts. They're heavily reliant on untrained conscripts. They're losing on the battlefield at a rate of 10-1. For every Ukrainian soldier who's killed, there's 10 Russians, because they're from the provinces, and they're conscripted into the military, given minimal training, minimal equipment, minimal food and water, and they're sent into battle under commanders that really are inept. So they're like I said, it's a 15-round fight. They're in at the end of round 12, and they're exhausted. That's the reality. The picture we're being fed through disinformation is very different.
No, it's interesting because the US does not, I mean, I don't know what the intelligence agencies are doing, but the US politically seems to be kind of falling into this trap. And the other opportunity that I see that doesn't appear to be taken advantage of, and again, obviously on the intelligence level, things take time and we don't know what anyone is doing. But again, politically, Russia is spreading itself all over Europe and various continents where they're trying to cultivate assets, support governments, and essentially create this anti-American, pro-Russian sentiment. Now, that's a lot of people to try to control. And, Russia, okay, oligarchs have money. Russia can force these people to pay up their stolen goods for the sake of, relatively low cost sake of maintaining all these apparatus. But the US and its allies can do the same thing. They could be fighting over these assets. They could be luring them away. And I'm sure on an individual level, that's what might happen. But, the interesting thing is these political lobbies that Russia uses to cause social upheavals, the US and others haven't figured out how to counter those political issues and how to create policies that will answer those grievances so that Russia can't, and how to talk to these people, how to engage with the people being targeted by Russia wholesale. So how do we create this balance? Obviously, individual, I'm sure there are people being recruited all over the place, but broadly speaking, Russia still manages to outplay us politically, despite the
Yeah.
fact that it has far less to play with in terms of resources and everything else.
Yeah, so their ability to outplay us politically, I think it's a very valid point, and I think part of the problem is what we need today is a Winston Churchill in 1940. We don't have that in the West. A president, and here again, I don't want to get into partisan politics because I don't think it's a partisan political issue as much as it is a personality issue. So President Biden, for a variety of reasons, needs to step up and say, here's why we're supporting Ukraine. Here's why it's in America's national interest to do so. Here's what the implications are if we don't do those things. All right. If you think about Winston Churchill in 1940. All right. Think about the state that Britain was in. That they managed to evacuate the British army from Dunkirk. They brought them back home and they're waiting for the Nazis to invade. Oh, by the way, when they left Dunkirk, they left all their equipment behind. So now you've got the remnants of the British army back home with no equipment. And the Germans are getting prepared to do an amphibious invasion. And there were people in England at the time who were like, okay, let's cut a deal with Hitler. Okay. They were despondent. They were convinced that things were lost. But here was Winston Churchill, who was able to step up. He gave 5 speeches in 1940 that you could point to that motivated and united the British public in ways that made it impossible for them to give up. Okay. This is what we need in the West. Right? We don't have that analogous type of personality to stand up and say, like a Ronald Reagan, for example. And I'm not saying it because Reagan was Republican. I'm not saying that at all. It's just his personality was such where he could explain to people why we needed to do something. And part of the problem that we have in the United States today, and also in Western Europe as well, because they're also liberal democracies, is that everything gets associated with a political party. Oh, you're saying that because you're a Democrat. Or you're saying that because you were a Republican. Well, some things are just empirical truths that have no political association, right? And that's how this has got to be conveyed to the American public, that we are in in a conflict. And oh, by the way, a lot of times if I post something on social media, I get allegations, oh, you're a warmonger. Let me tell you, I'm the last thing I am. Anybody who's been in the military, and I've served in 30 countries, you don't want a war because you know what that involves and you know what the costs are. So I would much rather support Ukraine today, less than 5% of our defense budget. No US troops are being put in harm's way. The Ukrainians are just asking us, hey, give us the stuff. We'll fight this battle ourselves. We'll eject the Russian invaders from our territory. I would rather do that than later on down the road, because Vladimir Putin, like all autocrats in history, he's never going to wake up in the morning and say, you know what? I've had enough. I'm going to stop. Okay. I'm going to go and spend my billions and billions of dollars I've acquired. Right? No. The problem is he'll go even further. People in Moldova, I spent time last year in Romania and in Georgia. Right. So they're both Romania on the border with Ukraine, Georgia, southern border, 20% of Georgia occupied by the way by Russians. You know this. So these are countries where people look at things in a very different way than Americans do. For us, it's a problem that's halfway around the world. For them, it's next door. All right. And they're concerned. So where you sit determines how you stand, right? And the position you take.
Well, here's another thing. Reagan and Thatcher at the time firmly believed several things. First, they believed that they could win. Second, that they could collapse, put an end to the Soviet Union, much less win the Cold War. Second, they believed that they had every right to do that, and that US and UK and the Western way of life was, without equivocation, better. It was a better system, and they believed in the freedoms. And I'm sure they saw the Western shortcomings, but they certainly didn't see it from the myopic standpoint that the Soviet propaganda portrayed them. But it seems to me that not only Biden himself, but the United States most officials today, on both sides of the aisle, do not sure how to define a victory.
Right.
Second, they're not sure that it's winnable. They seem to not be able to understand our strengths and weaknesses and Russia's strengths and weaknesses, violating Sun Tzu's basic principles. And third, they're not sure that I think down at the bottom, they're not sure that we deserve to win.
Yeah. No,
So
this
how
is
do
a
you
little.
fight a war with such an attitude?
Yeah, that's a real problem. And also another problem is that there's no alternative to Putin in Russia right now. There's nobody you could point to and say, oh, let's support this person against Putin. I mean, think about this. If Boris Nemtsov had become president of Russia, would we be having this problem, this conversation today? Absolutely not. Right. But the problem is that Putin, over the last 24 years, has killed off, driven into exile, jailed anybody who even thinks about opposing him. So the problem for us is that if we get rid of Putin, and this is an argument I've heard a lot of people voice as well. Well, if you get rid of Putin, the next guy could be worse, right? The next guy could be worse, but we've got to figure out some way to cultivate, first of all, to find somebody suitable to support, and then be able to support them in a way that's not going to get them jailed or killed or driven into exile.
Well, by definition, anyone, that would have to probably be someone from the intelligence community to lead a double life of being a Western supported individual, yet appear loyal to the paranoia in Kremlin. And it's not easy to get a hold of such people. There is vast corruption in Russia, to be sure, but as of now, everyone is scared enough or corrupt enough to be benefiting from the regime in its current form. Why would they want a different survival? The Russian model does not lend itself to democracy. There is
No.
a concern that, should they come to power, they would have to spend all their time battling other people trying to. So without restructuring the entire Russian political sphere, which I don't see as doable at this point in time, I don't really see how we could arrive at that result.
No, well, as you mentioned, a Russian political culture and American political culture are night and day differences. Night and day differences. And they've look at their history, even well before the former Soviet Union and in Tsarist times, right? Everybody just basically kept out of politics, and it's not a good thing to open your mouth and deviate from what you're told to believe. So you're working not only against the current political culture, you're also working against Russian history and what people just viscerally understand about themselves. So and understand too, I wanted to say at the outset, I have nothing at all against the Russian people. On the contrary, I know a lot of people in Russia, a lot of people in Ukraine, phenomenal people in both countries. And it really saddens me that we even have to have this conversation. But the reality is, you look at the situation in Russia from a political perspective, this 2024 election is going to be a farce, right? Just like all the previous ones were. Putin is determined that the only way he's going to leave the Kremlin is in a horizontal position in a wooden box, at the end of his natural days. That's what he plans to do. So, do we want to continue to live with his aggression and his misbehavior and his attacking the United States in different ways? Do we want to live with that for years and years down the road? But what's the alternative? That's a good question, and it's more than a rhetorical question.
I mean, I think you were right in saying that Russia's military resources and its economics, make it, in general, normally, if it didn't have this massive disinformation apparatus and massive intelligence dedication, it would have not been unsustainable completely. It would not have been able to project power the way it does. It would not have been able to gain as many allies as it has, and it certainly would not have been able to meddle and cause problems and distract the way it has. So our biggest problem is not Russian military, not Russian economy, not even Russian politics. It's the fact that we are simply have not adapted and adjusted to the way Russia is fighting this war through information and through minds. Now,
Yeah.
you've pointed out some of the challenges inherent to democratic liberal societies, but of course, you know, if we're not even trying, if you're not even, in the race, we can't possibly even, we are automatically forfeiting it, much less trying to win. And as far as I see, the resources that have been dedicated either by US government or any institutions in not only countering disinformation, but even understanding why it works and how it
Right.
works, and much less trying to push back at it abroad, be out of a field. It's been minimal. It's been nearly non-existent. The work U.S. government has tried to do with social media companies has created more problems than it solved for
Exactly.
legal and political reasons. So what do we? How do? There seems to be a lack of understanding among the political class about the fact that information warfare in this particular conflict is primary, not not a collateral. So how can that message be delivered?
Well, this is a real challenge, and I worked a lot in information operations in my career as well. So I was a human intelligence officer, but I also worked in the field of information operations. And the thing is, because of U.S. law, because of our history, because of our freedoms, it makes it hard for us to say, okay, this government agency is going to be responsible for countering foreign disinformation, right? It's just a difficult thing for us to do. Let me give you an example. So Obama administration during the ISIS years, right? So 2013 to around 2019, during that period of time. So in the Obama administration, ISIS propaganda was really a problem because they were recruiting Westerners who couldn't even spell Islam, okay, and recruiting people like that to come to the caliphate and fight. So we had to figure out, how do we counter ISIS propaganda? So under Obama, they set up something called the Global Engagement Center in the State Department, right? So Global Engagement Center, part of the problem is, number one, it's in the State Department. And I used to be a military attaché. I've worked in U.S. embassies. These are some of the hardest, brightest people I'll ever meet, or I work in the State Department. But I don't think that's where this should reside, because I don't think that it's all a white world public information function. I think there's got to be more to it than that. And that's not really what State Department does. So I think that we created that, and it was kind of lower in the food chain within the State Department. So it's got to be in the right organization. You have to have the right horsepower, right? Where you've got enough government support from the executive branch saying, and also from the legislative branch, saying this is what you need to do, and here's what you're able to do. Here are your left and right boundaries. But that hasn't happened. Okay. So yeah, we set up this GEC. It was intended not to counter Russia, but to counter ISIS, right? And the problem is, this is the vestige of what we've got. And that almost got derailed, by the way, because of the whole issue of allegations about the government coming in and telling social media companies, oh, silence that person, block that person, kick this person off the platform. So when you do stuff like that, then it undermines your ability to really engage in an effective disinformation campaign against a determined adversary like the Russian government. That's kind of where we're at.
Well, we also have existing other channels of communication. We have the Voice of America type structures. We used to have the U.S. Information Agency, and specifically, we used to have the agency dedicated to counter propaganda. And they used to have an entire structure of the way they did their work that had nothing to do with this fight of silencing political enemies. So
Right.
why can't we simply revive what worked the first time around?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I can tell you from firsthand experience, my in-laws who lived in Moscow, they were dissidents living in the former Soviet Union, and they every night would listen to Voice of America, Radio Liberty, BBC, right, which was illegal. They would never, discuss it with their friends that they did this. But the thing is, it was so essential, because at the time that was public information. And here's an important differentiator. Those were propaganda channels, right? But here's the thing, they never lied. Now, they maybe didn't tell you the full truth, but that's different, okay? If I tell you the 90% of the story and it's true, but I don't give you the other 10% that maybe doesn't look so good, that's public information, right? So you're not lying, but what happens is the people that listen to your broadcasts, they get influenced by the truth, and they're used to being told the truth. And what happens is the story that you get from Radio Liberty, BBC, Voice of America, and then you hear what you're getting from your government, which is diametrically opposed. You say, well, wait a minute, I know these guys are telling me the truth. Maybe like my government is lying to me. So we've got to get back into that game. We've gotten back into it to some extent, but we've got to do an awful lot more. If for no other reason than to make Putin nervous. If for no other reason but to make Putin nervous. Because if he knows his people are getting the truth, that's gonna make him look over his shoulder, and that may make him hesitate in some ways.
But before we even consider how to fight our enemies effectively, we have another domestic problem to overcome, which is the distrust in our own institutions and our own intelligence agencies. When you have, top media personalities and former presidents coming out and basically saying, the deep state, blah, 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 or don't I trust Russia more than I trust the US intelligence agencies. That's a problem. That sends a message, even if you don't particularly agree with these people and other things. How do you counter that sort of, perception? How to regain public trust?
Yeah, and what you're just describing is a battle I literally fight every day, because from a political perspective, I mean, I've been a registered Republican my entire life. I was a Reagan Republican. And what I find, though, for example, is in my support for Ukraine, most of the people are Democrats, because this has become evolved into a partisan issue. And my argument is it's not a partisan issue. There are some things that we can fight like cats and dogs over from a partisan political perspective, fine. But there are certain things that are existential in nature, okay, that you've got to embrace regardless of your political perspective. And this is one of the problems that I think social media has exacerbated. The fact that now everything is viewed through a partisan political lens. And if you think about it, it also ties into our perception of the media. People live in their own echo chambers, right? So we get our news we get from the media platforms we prefer. So if you're on the right, maybe it's Fox. If you're on the left, maybe CNN and MSNBC, whatever it is. You have your newspapers that you prefer. You have your friends you listen to. So what ends up happening is we all live in our little echo chambers, and the government is not doing a very effective job of transcending that, breaking into that. Because this is why I was saying earlier, we need a Winston Churchill. We need somebody in the government who can step up and say, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Because understand, in the Cold War, we had a bipartisan approach for the most part to foreign policy. We did. Now, there were exceptions to that, obviously, but I could sit here for an hour and tell you what the exceptions were. But the point is, by and large, we had a bipartisan approach to the fact that the Soviet Union was a threat to us. We had to confront that threat and do certain things. And that's what we need to get back to. That's what we need to get back to, this bipartisan. Let's set aside the partisan nonsense and let's focus on this. First of all, recognize the threat for what it is. Because like I said, today it's, do we help Ukraine to do what they need to do to defend themselves? In 2, 3, 5 years down the road, it may be a very different problem that we have, one that we could avoid today if we do the right things.
Now, there was another issue that I think is worth mentioning, which is threat assessment. During the Cold War, without a question, communism was the top threat it was such a top threat, singular focus of our policy that we literally ignored everything else, including the repercussions of some of these threats, empowering Islamist groups, dealing with untrustworthy allies, and so forth. Now, I'm not entirely sure. We have two issues. First, there's a growing public perception that's not in line with the official assessments. A poll I saw the other day shows that there's a shift in public opinion from viewing Russia and China, state actors, as a #1 threat to seeing it as #3 threat behind migration and border security and other various things that are not connected to that. And on the other hand, you have had some very public, inaccurate intelligence assessment of risks in Afghanistan, in the situation with Hamas in Gaza. The US intelligence and the Israeli intelligence both failed to predict, to observe the outcome. They were distracted with other things. They misassessed that. So that also does not lend itself to credibility in institutions. And there is no way to make a transparent case for how things have changed since those two, major public, disasters. So how do we deal with these things? One, the public assessment of threats that diverges from, you know, the government approaches, or at least, challenges it to some extent. And two, the major mistakes made by structural issues in the intelligence community, and the fact that there is no real, no fast way to overcome them, even with the best of intentions. And I'm not sure that we have even that at this point.
Right. Well, for example, you mentioned Afghanistan. I served in Afghanistan 2003, 2004 timeframe. And I can remember even then, we were involved in nation building, and we had our NATO partners, we had non-NATO partners, and everybody was there. Well, first of all, every country that contributed forces to that effort, they had their own rules of engagement. They were allowed to do certain things, they were not allowed to do certain things. So you had that problem. Another problem is that in the case of Afghanistan, narcotics production was such a big moneymaker for the Afghan population. We wanted to go in and eradicate the poppy, right, in the fields, because 80% of what was coming out of 80% of what was available in the street in Amsterdam, for example, came from Afghanistan. So the Dutch in particular, and Germans and other countries, they wanted to eradicate that, but we couldn't do it because of the Afghan government didn't want us to do it, and also because of the fear that we couldn't replace that income. There was nothing the farmers could grow that would be as lucrative to them as poppy, right? So the reason I mention this is sometimes the picture we're dealing with is more complex and not so easy to deal with. And then the intelligence folks have to look at that, present it to the decision makers and say, here's the challenge, here's the situation that you've got to deal with here. What do you do? The decision makers, on the other hand, and I don't want to put all the blame on decision makers, because they've got a number of pressures on them as well. They've got political pressures. They've got allies that have different agendas. They've got other factors that are maybe transparent to the intelligence folks, right? We don't know about what those pressures are, but that's what they're operating under, and they've got to make their decisions. So what ended up happening was, in Afghanistan, in a matter of months, we drove out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and put in President Karzai, right? That was the easy part. It was also easy in Iraq too, in 2003, comparatively. All right, going in, defeating Saddam Hussein's military, kicking out Saddam Hussein. In both countries, the hard part was afterward. It was the peacekeeping and nation building that was difficult. And those are very, very complex things. And the political leaders, they have a tendency to sit back and say, okay, thank you for the intel, appreciate it, but you don't understand the full picture. I've got a lot of other things I've got to take into account and to make my decisions. So I think part of it is, and again, people like to say intelligence failures. Sometimes the intelligence is on the money and accurate, and it's the decision making that is wrong. Okay, but I'm not saying that intel doesn't make mistakes. I mean, you mentioned 7 October or the Yom Kippur War, 1973. Another example where intel failed. Intel does fail sometimes, but not as often as people think.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly reported that way a lot, but, it's hard to, when we have to deal with these public narratives, it's hard to assess how, we see, okay, the CIA calculated that the Taliban regime will reach Kabul in, 3 months, but it only took a week or whatever, something like that. So when we hear things like that, the automatic question is, who is doing their jobs down there? How can we trust the people who can't figure out just how much of the territory is actually under, Taliban control, for instance, or,
Right.
Ukraine with the Prigozhin fiasco. Why did we not have things, a plan to react to some sort of to move faster when something like that occurred with the uprising or the move or whatever the heck that was.
Yeah, exactly. If I could tell you a quick war story from Afghanistan. So in the last year of the war, not long before the total collapse, there was an Afghan Special Forces unit. Now, the Afghan Special Forces, we trained them, the British trained them, Our NATO allies trained them. They were very competent. They were very motivated. They're very capable. The problem is this unit got cut off, and they needed support from the Afghan National Army. The Afghan National Army didn't provide it, right? And they basically let these guys get captured, and they were executed by the Taliban. Here's the problem with that type of scenario. When something like that happens, you have a ripple effect throughout the entire body of military, security forces, whatever, supporting the Kabul government, because they sit back and say, well, wait a minute, if they weren't willing to go in and support these special forces guys, what are my chances of getting support if I need it? See what I mean? And this is not something that is necessarily predictable, but it's one of the things that had a huge impact on the sustainability of the Afghan government after that incident happened. So what I'm saying is, you can't predict everything. You can't. You can predict what, for example, CIA predicted the collapse of Yugoslavia before it happened. They predicted the collapse of the former Soviet Union before it happened, right? Sometimes the intel is right, but you can't anticipate everything. You can't, nobody could have really predicted a Prigozhin. Nobody could have really, years ahead of when it happened. Nobody could have predicted that they were going to empty out the prisons and send them in under, Wagner Group. These are things that when they happen, you have to sort of address them and report on them, but they're not necessarily predictable.
Do you think, given the complexity of today's intelligence tasks compared to the Cold War, given I disagree with the Russian description of it as a multipolar world, but it's certainly a world where Russia and others work in tighter networks, and it's complicated by the globalization of communications, by non-state actors such as big tech companies and data analytics companies, and all these private actors playing a growing role, and soft power institutions sprawling, and all of that. It's certainly a more complicated threat network that we are facing. What can be done to create a rapid response team or teams or some sort of a thing that, even if you can't predict a particular scenario, what can you do to be able to respond to it in a flexible, creative way that doesn't get stuck in a bureaucratic morass and lose the immediate advantage?
Yeah. Wow. So one thing I can tell you, for example, the Department of Defense, one thing the Department of Defense does really well is contingency planning. What do we do if this happens? Because here's the problem. If something happens where the Department of Defense has to react, they've got to move people, they've got to move equipment, they've got to move resources, they've got to have things deployed to wherever the part of the world is in a certain order. So you've got to plan, and you don't plan when the emergency arises, you plan ahead of it, right? You anticipate, and then you say, okay, we're going to dust off this plan, which applies to this situation, and we're going to respond to it. So Department of Defense does it really well. Rest of the government, not so much, because and part of the problem is they've already got so many things that they're trying to deal with, so many irons in the fire, so to speak, that to turn around and say, hey, carve out 20% of your time and do contingency planning. What would you do if this was to happen tomorrow, right? Now, government organizations probably do some of that, but they certainly don't do enough of it. So that's part one, is we've got to do the contingency planning. What would we do if this situation came up? So that's part one. Then part two is, who's going to be in charge and who's going to deal with it, right? And it doesn't matter if it's Hurricane Katrina. It doesn't matter if it's some other calamity. You've got to have some kind of plans in place and some kind of. And we look at Hurricane Katrina 2004, for example. That was a calamity. It was one that should have been planned for properly. We should have had a better plan in place, and then be able to come in. If you have a plan, you can execute the plan. But if you don't have a plan, then it's a moot point. Then you're just 7-year-olds playing soccer, right? Everybody's chasing the ball, and you don't have any strategy.
Well, another part of the problem, as I see it, is long term, and it's not something that could be easily fixed, even if we had a Reagan-esque, president. And that is long-term institutional erasure of trust and narrative building. We have lost our sort of narrative of being the good guys. We seem to be inundated with identity politics on both sides of the aisle, by the way. Victimhood, narratives, blaming, just navel gazing, and just essentially, we are so over focused over our various past mistakes and shortcomings in institutional and social and otherwise, that we don't seem to, we seem to have, you know lost the confidence in that our institutions can do the right thing under the right
Yeah,
circumstances. This is the freedom that we used to enjoy during the Cold War. The agencies made their share of, wrong-headed decisions for sure, but overall, they had the public trust to, in general, take the right direction at least. Now, I'm not sure that it is the case. So that is not something that I think can be done with an executive order or a nice speech. What can be done in the long term to fix this public perception problem and this entire, failed narrative problem?
yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, when I was growing up, I graduated high school in the 1970s, right? And at that time, the 1970s was a time where there was a lot of criticism about the intelligence community, a lot of criticism toward the government. You had Watergate, you had excesses by FBI doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. You had CIA doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. So what ended up happening was the pendulum kind of swung in the other direction. People were disappointed in the government, distrustful of the government, in a lot of ways very similar to today, oddly enough. But what happened was when Reagan came into office, there was a lot more effective messaging. There was a lot more funding for the military. There was Congress had passed laws, for example, the FISA Act, 1978, limiting telephone monitoring, right, by the federal government. So Congress, the executive branch, they did things that restored public confidence in the government. And it wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, and it's not going to be fast and easy today. But there's got to be more unanimity between the executive branch and Congress, and not just fighting like, monkeys in the zoo, throwing substances at each other. They've got to collaborate in this way to
Mhm.
regain public confidence. Because here's the thing, as I mentioned earlier, that's the function of disinformation, is to destroy our confidence in the government, in the media, right? And if we're already doing that to ourselves, we're just making it easier for our adversaries to get away with that.
Can this actually really be fixed at a time when, you know, more talented and dedicated people don't want to go into government precisely because of all these obstacles? And therefore, we're seeing people who are, self-serving increasingly end up in echelons of power at various levels, whether it's governance, intelligence, or anything else.
Well, I'm happy to tell you. I mean, I look at the students that I have in my classroom, and it was funny because quick war story. When I was here my first semester, I was talking on the phone to my wife, and she says, "So, what are your students like?" And I said, "Oh, sometimes," I told her, I said, "I feel like I'm the dumbest guy in the world because they're really smart, they're really capable, they have the heart in the right place." And then she laughed and she says, "Yeah," she says, "at home we call that dinner time, right? Or I'm the dumbest guy in the room." I said, "All right." So my point to you though is that my students that I have here in the intelligence program, they're very bright. I feel confident knowing that they're going into the intelligence community. They're going to do things not only in national security, but also intelligence support to law enforcement, also competitive intelligence, right? So they're going to go into those fields and they're going to do the right thing. So I think part of it is we've got to allow them, the next generation, to move forward and to take those positions. But we've also got to make a concerted effort, the government does, right, to help restore public confidence in the news media, in the government, so that when these people that I'm teaching today go into positions of authority and they come forward and say, "Hey, Mr. Decision Maker, here's the intelligence," that they're respected and their opinions are trusted.
This, I think, is actually very helpful. Now, I want to ask you in a more free, as a sort of conclusion question, what are your best recommendations, takeaways, lessons from the Cold War, from past intelligence actions to today's? What would you say and recommend that we should be doing, looking at, that we haven't thought of, that or that has faded among the noise of the various balls we're all trying to juggle?
Well, I think the first thing, recommendation, if I was king for a day or president for a day, I would say we've got to make a concerted effort to get the American people to trust their government and to trust the media. So part of it is it's going to have to be a conversation between the government and the media outlets and say, look, this is a problem we have, we've got to fix it. Because the problem is until you fix that, whatever messages you're putting out from the government, whatever messages you're putting out from the media won't be fully trusted. So you've got to fix that problem first. You've got to fix the public confidence factor. The second is, I think the government needs to do a better job of articulating, here's why we need to support the Ukrainians, here's what the nature of the threat is from Vladimir Putin, paint a picture for the American people so they're not just left to their own opinions and wandering around saying, what do I support? Because if they're wandering around saying, what do I support? They fall victim to the echo chambers, they listen to the people that they trust in other things who may not be wise or may even be co-opted by the Russians, right? So you've got to address that part of it as well. And the third thing is basically messaging. We got to do better messaging into Russia, as we had done in the past. Very effective. I would argue that over time brought us, for example, a lot of people that defected because they had listened to those radio broadcasts in part, right? That they listened to that and they realized that, hey, I'm part of something that I don't really believe in. Okay. So I think those are three things that we've got to do better at. And I recognize that they're not easy to do. Messaging, and here again, in terms of pushing a message out overseas, we have laws that maybe we need to relook those laws and say, maybe we need to allow for things we haven't allowed for in the past. So just a quick example to amplify what I'm talking about. You're not allowed to propagandize the American people. You're not allowed to do that. So in other words, you can message foreign audiences, but the problem is you can't direct messages, propaganda against the American people. Well, in the era of social media, how do you differentiate and say, well, we're only going to message folks overseas, right? So I think we've got to get the lawyers in the room. We've got to get the policymakers in the room and say, here's the entirety of our problem. How do we deal with it? What do we need to fix? And then get busy. Because right now, it's getting worse rather than better.
Yeah, there have been incidents where American social media companies have taken off US government-backed campaigns aimed at foreign countries, Central Asia, or whatever it is, because they claim that it's, entangling US citizens.
Right. Right. So the whole relationship between the US government and the private companies that run these foreign media, social media platforms, that's got to be improved as well. That's been problematic, that relationship.
Well, part of the problem is that what started out as free platforms that were just basically, people messaging each other became huge companies with their own interests and their own data gathering models and their own agenda. They're not just people talking to each other, they're being amplified, and the conversation is being regulated and manipulated and boosted to some extent. So you can't say that this is just people in a room talking to each other. That is not, normally if you're in a room, you talk at the same volume, or, you don't have somebody else amplifying your voice or, on the contrary, blocking what you're trying to say. So So yeah, it's quite challenging because these private actors are doing the job that the US institutions have failed to develop. You have Elon Musk with the satellites. The US has not invested in these structures, and now they're dependent on one personality with his own political and financial interests.
Right. No, and as I mentioned before, social media is a relatively new creation. 2006 was not that long ago, okay? And part of it is we're in sort of adjustment mode. What do we do? These are the problems we've never had to deal with before. Nobody anticipated them. So we've got to make a more concerted effort to deal with them because they're really intrinsic and part of this bigger picture issue that we've been talking about.
I think one of the issues is not specifically that we can't anticipate every problem that could come up, but that we don't even have the mechanisms for resolving such problems. We have Congress doing its own thing. We have, various bodies within the executive branch meddling in their own ways. We have, regulatory agencies stepping in. So there is no actual decision when a new innovation in technology happens, AI, VR, cloning, cryptocurrency, whatever, who is actually going to be the lead on regulation, on ethics, on coordination with the private sector. We don't
Yeah.
need to have a coordinated approach to the problem resolution process.
Right. Well, if you look at it historically, this has been a constant problem. I teach a national security class for our sophomores. And literally from the first day of class, I tell them technology is going to be part of what we talk about in this class, every single class, because technology is inseparable from intelligence. It's inseparable from national security, because every technological advancement creates opportunities, but also creates threats, right?
Mhm.
And you can look through even, for example, the printing press, Gutenberg, right? Gutenberg invents the printing press, had a lot of positive impact, a lot of positive consequences. And along comes Martin Luther, who uses the printing press to disseminate his opinions, right? So then you ended up having the 7 Years' War down the road. So my point is, you've got for any identifiable technological development, there's going to be positives, there's going to be negatives, and there's going to be a period of adjustment where the government has to sit back and figure out what are the implications of this technology? Are they good? Are they bad? What do we need to do? What laws do we need to change? We're still in that adjustment period to social media, even though it was created, almost a decade ago.
Shouldn't it be also, the private sector is going to do what it's going to do, and we can't potentially predict what will even work out of every startup there is. But in terms of what US is funding, investing into, and the kind of research is it doing, should that not be something that can help kind of war game some of these scenarios?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So just before the US got involved in World War II, so we're talking about maybe 6 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt got a guy from MIT, and he said, you're gonna lead an effort. It's going to be called the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD. And what OSRD did was they took the best minds from private sector, the military, and the government, those three, private sector, military, and government, and they said, okay, you guys work on microwave. You develop this atomic bomb thing. You work on proximity fuses, right? And what happened was, and there were 18 or 19 different entities around the country, because we were not the world's leader in technology in 1940. We were not at all, okay? We had a lot of catching up to do. The Germans were well ahead of us in a number of areas. By the end of the war, we had caught up because, in part, the government had made this determination that we need technology, we need to make advances, we need to overcome the advantages that our enemies have in these technological fields. And that's what really turned things around, okay? So I think we've got to have a similar approach where we say, the government has got to say, okay, let's get in certain folks from the private sector, some from academia, some from the military, and say, this is an emerging technology. What are the implications? What do we need to prepare for? How do we deal with this? What laws need to be changed, right? So this, I think, is an essential approach that the government had done before during the Second World War, and we need to do similarly today.
Yeah, it seems that we've had successes in the past. I don't know why we don't build and replicate them when we are facing challenges that are more complex, but not in their nature dissimilar. Because at the end of the day, the human nature, the nature of dictatorships, the nature of power dynamics doesn't change from the number of factors and technical issues becoming more complex. It's just
Right.
new tools and new actors.
Well, our problem in this country, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, Americans will eventually do the right thing after they tried all the wrong things first. You know what I mean? But here's the problem. We live in a different world. We live in where time is compressed. We don't have time to waste doing all the wrong things first. We've got to do the right things from the start. And that's something we've had a problem with.
Well, I certainly hope that as a result of discussions such as this one that are becoming public, not just, snippets of reactions to events on social media, but in-depth, thoughtful conversations. Maybe people will start to wake up and think about these problems, not just as a way for them to get their name into the media, but also as a way to solve long-term complicated problems that require a lot of minds and a lot of input from very different people.
Yeah, I agree, Irina.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for this insightful discussion. For those watching us, we had Professor Fred Hoffman. We were discussing the lessons that could be gleaned from the intelligence communities and their actions during the Cold War to today. How we can apply this knowledge, this wisdom, and this experience, as well as the mistakes that we made, to the current challenges that we are facing. And please stay tuned for next week's program. Same time, Tuesday night, 9 p.m. And have a great night.